The auction gavel fell on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday, Eleanor Vane's name had been erased from the building she designed. Not literally. The brass plaque bolted to the lobby wall of the Halcyon Tower still read E. Vane and Associates, founding architect, 1994. But the tenant directory upstairs had already been reprinted. Her office, the corner one on the 19th floor, with the view of the river she'd insisted on when there was nothing to see but scaffolding, now belonged to a man named Desmond Cole, her son-in-law, her successor, the man who had told a courtroom under oath that she had falsified structural inspection reports on a downtown high-rise to save 11 weeks and $4 million, reports that were later found conveniently in her own handwriting. She had spent 31 months in a minimum security facility outside Poughkeepsie for it, a crime she had not committed, for a building that had not in the end collapsed, though 8 tenants had been quietly relocated after cracks appeared in a stairwell nobody could explain, and nobody in the firm had asked her opinion on why. If you have ever built something with your own hands and watched someone else claim it, you already know the particular kind of grief this is. It doesn't feel like sadness. It feels like standing outside your own house in the rain, watching the lights on inside, and realizing you no longer have a key. This is not a story about a woman who forgave. This is a story about a woman who counted. Act 1, the house that cracks built. Eleanor Vane built things that lasted. That was the whole of her philosophy, distilled from a childhood spent watching her father, a structural engineer in Ohio, walk the length of every bridge he ever built, alone, at night, running his palm along the guardrails like he was checking a pulse. A building is a promise, he used to say. Don't sign your name to one you can't keep. She carried that promise into 40 years of practice. She built libraries that outlived their budgets, hospitals that survived earthquakes they weren't rated for, a bridge over the Kestrel River that the state used in engineering textbooks as a model of conservative, honest design. She built a firm from a card table in a rented studio into 300 employees and a skyline's worth of buildings bearing her signature in steel and glass. She also, less carefully, built a family. Her daughter, Priya, was brilliant and restless, an engineer in her own right who had never quite escaped the shadow of her mother's name on every building she walked past. Priya's husband, Desmond, arrived at the firm 11 years ago as a junior project manager, charming, ambitious, disarmingly good at making people feel like the smartest person in the room was the one he was currently talking to. Eleanor liked him immediately, which she would later understand was the precise quality that made him dangerous. Desmond rose fast. Too fast, some of the senior partners muttered, though never to Eleanor's face, because by then Eleanor had made him her deputy, had signed authority for large swaths of the firm's operations over to him, so she could spend more time on the design work she loved and less on payroll and permits. She trusted him the way you trust a bridge you built yourself, because you were there when the foundation was poured. The cracks, the real ones, in the stairwell of 4400 Bellhaven, the firm's flagship residential tower, appeared 18 months before her arrest. A junior inspector flagged them in a routine report. Eleanor remembered reading that report at her kitchen table, coffee going cold, and calling an emergency structural review. She remembered signing off on remediation work, real steel, real money, and she remembered distinctly handing the file to Desmond to close out with the city.
She did not remember signing a second contradicting report 3 weeks later, one that claimed the remediation was unnecessary and the cracks were cosmetic settling. But her signature was on it. Forensic handwriting analysts for the prosecution swore it was hers. Her own attorney, a competent but overmatched man named Felix Otero, could not explain the discrepancy, and juries do not acquit on things nobody can explain. What Eleanor remembered, lying awake in a cell with a view of a parking lot, was the particular stillness of Desmond's face in the courtroom gallery. Not smug, not cruel, just still. The way a lake is still right before a stone breaks its surface. The stillness of a man watching something he'd set in motion finally land. Act 2, 31 months prison, did not break Eleanor Vane. It did something worse and more useful. She had always been a woman who thought in load paths, how weight travels through a structure, where it wants to go, where it must be redirected before it finds the weak point and settles there permanently. In the visiting room, twice a month, Priya came alone, her face doing something complicated every time, love and doubt wrestling for the same square inch of expression. She never quite said, "I believe you." She also never quite said the opposite. Eleanor learned to read the silence between those two absences, like a stress diagram. "He's running the firm well," Priya told her once. Ninth month, not quite meeting her eyes. "The Bellhaven settlement is finalized. Everyone's moving on." "Everyone," Eleanor repeated. "Mom." Priya's hands were flat on the table, the way she used to hold blueprints steady against wind on a job site.
"I have to believe he wouldn't do that. I'm married to him."
"I have a daughter with him." "I know," Eleanor said, and meant it, and hated that she meant it, because it would have been so much simpler to be angry at Priya instead of terrified for her. What Priya did not know, what Eleanor would not tell her yet, because a granddaughter needs a father more than a grandmother needs a witness, was that Eleanor had spent those 31 months doing the one thing prison could not take from her: thinking about signatures. She had signed thousands of documents in her career. She knew her own hand the way she knew her own face, and she knew, with the calm, load-bearing certainty of an engineer who has checked her math 3 times, that the signature on that second report was not hers. It was close enough to fool experts who were, she came to understand slowly, and without satisfaction, not actually looking very hard, because the firm's outside counsel, hired and paid for by Desmond in his new capacity as acting principal, had handed the prosecution's expert a curated packet of known exemplars to compare against. Eleanor did not need a lawyer to tell her what a curated exemplar packet could do to an analysis. She had built her career on knowing that the data you're given shapes the conclusion you reach, whether the data is concrete strength tests or handwriting samples.
Prove any of this from a cell, so she did the only thing available to her. She remembered everything in order, with dates, and she waited. Her cellmate for the final 11 months was a soft-spoken forger named Ruth Ann Petch, 60 years old, doing 4 years for a check-kiting scheme she described, without much remorse, as underfunded. Ruth Ann had spent 30 years studying the small betrayals of a signature under duress, under haste, under forgery, the places where a copied hand almost always tells on itself. Eleanor spent those 11 months learning to see her own name the way a forger sees it, not as an identity, but as a set of measurable habits. The pressure at the tail of the V, the particular hesitation before the final E, things a machine could verify, things a curated exemplar packet, chosen specifically to not include her more distinctive later career signatures, would never have surfaced. By the time Eleanor Vane walked out through the gate on a gray October morning, she did not have proof. She had a method, and she had a name, Dr. Ines Callahan, a forensic document examiner in Baltimore whom Ruth Ann swore was the best in the country and owed Ruth Ann a favor that had nothing to do with checks. Act 3. What she found. Eleanor did not go home. She did not have a home. The townhouse had been sold 8 months into her sentence to cover legal costs, Priya had explained, apologetically, over a static-filled phone line. Instead, she went to a motel off the interstate under her maiden name, Eleanor Reyes, and she began, methodically, to rebuild the one thing nobody could repossess, her own case. Dr. Callahan took 6 weeks. She did not need the original document. The city still had its certified copy on file, a matter of public record, and Eleanor had learned decades ago that public record requests move slower for angry people and faster for polite, patient ones. When the report came back, it did not merely say the signature was inconsistent with Eleanor's known hand. It identified, with a precision that made Eleanor's chest ache with something close to grief for her younger self, the specific software used to generate it, a signature overlay tool marketed to graphic designers, popular 5 years ago, since discontinued, whose file metadata, when Callahan traced backward through the city's own document management system, which nobody had thought to scrub because nobody had thought anyone would look, had been created on a workstation registered to the firm's IT department under a login belonging to a since-departed junior associate named Trent Kowalczyk. Trent Kowalczyk was easy to find. He was working retail in Scranton, having left the architecture industry entirely 2 years prior, and he answered his door with the flinching posture of a man who had been waiting 3 years for a knock he couldn't name. He did not need much persuading. He had, it turned out, been carrying the weight of it the way people carry things they did under pressure from someone they were afraid to refuse, badly and alone.
Told me it was a formatting fix, Trent said, sitting across from Eleanor at a diner booth, unable to look at her directly. He said the report needed to match a template the city required, and the original signature scan was low resolution, and could I just clean it up, recreate it so it would print clearly. He laughed, a small broken sound. I didn't think I was 26. I didn't think about what I was actually doing until I saw your name in the paper 8 months later. Would you say that in front of a judge? Eleanor asked. Trent's hands were shaking around his coffee cup. I've been waiting for someone to ask me that for 3 years. There was a second discovery, and this one Eleanor made herself, sitting in a public library with the firm's archived project files, which, under the terms of the city's building code, were required to remain accessible for public safety review for a period of 10 years, a regulation Eleanor herself had lobbied for in 2009 in a completely different context, never imagining it would one day be the crack in her own son-in-law's foundation. The remediation work Eleanor had ordered on the Belhaven stairwell, the real work, the $4 million of steel and labor that the second forged report claimed was unnecessary, had, according to the firm's own subcontractor invoices, never actually been performed. The city had been told the cracks were cosmetic and no fix was needed. The remediation budget had been approved, drawn down, and paid out to a contracting company called Bellwether Structural Solutions. Bellwether Structural Solutions, Eleanor learned from a $5 public corporate filing search, was registered to an address that traced through 2 shell layers to Priya's brother-in-law, Desmond's own brother, a man who did not, as far as anyone could determine, own so much as a hammer. $4 million drawn down for work that was never done, on a building where cracks had never actually been fixed, occupied by people who had been told they were safe. Eleanor Vane sat in that library for a long time, with her hand pressed flat against the cool table, the way she used to press her palm to unfinished concrete to feel whether it had cured correctly. And she understood, finally, the full shape of what had happened to her. It was never about the 11 weeks or the $4 million saved. It was about $4 million taken, laundered through a phantom repair, and a mother-in-law whose meticulous signature and unimpeachable reputation made the perfect scapegoat for a theft her own son-in-law had authored. She had learned, in 31 months, exactly how much good faith the system extends to a convicted felon, walking in with an accusation against a respected acting principal of a respected firm. Instead, she went to the one person whose signature this time would actually matter: the building's insurer. Act 4. The inspection. Halcyon Group, the firm's insurer, had a standing right, buried in paragraph 14 of every commercial policy they wrote, to order an independent structural reinspection of any insured property at any time, at their own expense, if credible new information suggested a prior claim had been improperly resolved. Eleanor knew this because she had read every insurance contract the firm ever signed, for 30 years, the way other people read novels. She did not sign the tip with her own name. She signed it as a concerned former tenant, and she attached Dr. Callahan's report, and she waited. The reinspection was ordered for a Thursday morning in March. Eleanor did not attend as Eleanor Vane, disgraced founder. She attended as a silent observer, accompanying Dr. Callahan, whom the insurer had separately and independently retained once their own internal review confirmed the document irregularities. A small, quiet mercy of a system, occasionally working the way it's supposed to, once someone hands it the right thread to pull. Desmond met them in the Belhaven lobby in a gray suit, composed, already rehearsing the explanation he'd give the board. A routine audit, nothing more, nothing to concern residents. He did not know Eleanor would be there until she stepped out of the elevator behind the inspection team, and for one unguarded half-second, his face did the thing she had waited 3 years to see. It cracked. Not dramatically, just a hairline fracture at the corner of his composure, there and gone, the same kind of fracture he had once explained away as cosmetic settling. "Eleanor," he said, I wasn't told you'd be. I wasn't told either, she said. I read it in a public filing. The same way I read everything else, Desmond. They found the cracks in the stairwell within 40 minutes. Worse now, 3 years further along, exactly where the original inspector had flagged them, exactly when no remediation had ever occurred. They found the Bellwether Structural Solutions paperwork in the building's permanent file within the hour, because Eleanor had already told them precisely where to look. Desmond did not confess there, in front of the inspection team, the Residents Association president, and his own increasingly pale general counsel. Men like Desmond rarely confess to a room. They confess eventually to a plea deal in a smaller room with far fewer witnesses and far worse lighting. But Priya was there. Eleanor had asked her to come, had told her only that it concerned the building and that she needed her daughter present as an engineer, not as a wife, not as a witness for either side, simply as someone whose eye Eleanor trusted to read a crack correctly. Priya knelt in that stairwell in her work boots, ran her palm along the fracture the way her grandfather used to run his palm along a guardrail, and understood, in the silence that followed, everything her mother had spent 3 years learning to say without saying it. She did not look at Desmond, she looked at the crack, and then she looked at her mother, and something in her face finally stopped wrestling and settled into something quieter and harder.
She did not ask for the corner office back. She did not, in the end, want it. She had spent 31 months learning that some rooms, once you've been made to leave them under false pretenses, are never quite the same room again, even when you return. Instead, she used the settlement, and there was, eventually, a settlement, considerable and public, to establish something new. A small, fiercely independent structural review firm, 3 employees at a card table that existed for exactly one purpose: to re-examine, at no cost to the tenants who requested it, any building whose remediation paperwork didn't sit right with somebody's gut. She named it after her father's old rule, the one she'd carried since Ohio, the one that had cost her 3 years and nearly cost her everything. Signed Promise Structural Review. Priya joined her 11 months later, not as a daughter making amends, but as an engineer who had, at last, learned to read the silence between 2 absences and choose the truth instead of the comfort. On the day the new office opened, no view of the river this time, just a walk up on a quiet street, room enough for a card table and a coffee machine, and a wall where she hung, for the first time in her career, not a rendering of a building, but the forensic overlay of 2 signatures, hers and the forgery, side by side, so that anyone who walked in could see exactly how close a lie has to be to pass for the truth. Eleanor Vane stood at the window and thought about her father, walking the length of his bridges alone at night, checking the guardrails like a pulse. A building is a promise, he used to say. Don't sign your name to one you can't keep. She had not broken hers. It had simply taken the world 3 years and one very patient old woman to notice that someone else had signed it for her. The end.